You, ladies and gentlemen, delightful to see that we have a packed room this morning as to show just how critical the African continent is. My name is Gugulethu Mfupi. I am with CNBC Africa, and I will be the moderator for this morning's event. Once more, I am looking forward to the conversations that we'll host, and many of you might recall that last year, around this time, similar conversations were held with regard to the state of the region in Africa. And it really focused on one of our most critical resources, being human capital, our people. But this time around, we take a look at not only how we can develop our people, but using digital and technology as key enablers for two critical sectors, which have really encouraged and bolstered the economic performance of the sub-Saharan African region. And that will be agriculture together with energy. And over the next hour and a half, ladies and gentlemen, you hear insight from government representatives, young dynamic entrepreneurs, as well as leaders within corporate institutions as to how best we can leverage technology in these two key sectors to not only cultivate human development, but drive economic growth for a continent which is so critical to global dynamics. With that said, I'd like to encourage you to participate very strongly in the conversation today. It's high energy, it's optimism, and of course, engagement from each and every one of you, because as we know, Africa can. And perhaps we need to hear that from the crowd today, just to make sure that you've all had your cups of coffee. Africa? Not loud enough, I think, right? Shall we try that one more time? Africa? There we go. And that's exactly the spirit that we're looking for throughout the next hour and a half. So not only can Africa with regard to its capabilities and opportunities, but we'll be taking a look at this through various platforms with regard to digital and agriculture and energy. A reminder that this is being broadcast live on CNBC Africa. And of course, we are being joined by individuals who are live streaming through the World Bank website. A very good morning and a warm welcome to each and every one of you who are watching as we are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Tweeting is encouraged. And if you don't, you might be an offender of a rule that I have decided to put in place, as we want you to share the message with the globe that not only Africa can, but we are involved and we are cultivating a spirit of development on our continent that we are actively participating in. The official hashtag to use is AfricaSOR, Africa, State of the Region. And again, we strongly encourage you to participate. I'll try it one more time just to make sure that as I welcome my next speaker on stage, that you'll share the same invigorating energy that you shared with me a moment ago. Africa? With that said, ladies and gentlemen, to give us our introductory remarks, please warmly welcome the World Bank Vice President for Africa, Makda Diop.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on Saturday morning. I know that you are extremely busy. It's at the end of this week we've been spending. That's State of the Region number 7. We never thought that we'd be taking that far. And you made it a reality. It started with a small conversation about what matters for us, what you, policymakers, civil society, private sector have in mind, and which feedback we can take from you to make our work better. And it started with a small conversation, and we have the first panelist who were in this event here. And it grew, and today we have a partnership that we developed with CNBC to allow us to talk to a larger audience, not only to people who are in Washington. So we're talking about what today about transformation of Africa, leapfrogging, technology, agriculture, energy. So we're trying to put all these topics together because we've been talking about each of them separately. So now how we can work towards making all these topics one topic. So we have a great panel that will be introduced later on. And we took a feedback that we gave us last time. We more youth and more women. So I think that this time we try to have more young women telling us what is happening on the continent. And you will see that they have tremendous ideas, each of them from the utility side, the public policy side, very sharp and brilliant startups. We have a policymaker. He's the only man beside me and Albert. will tell us a little bit what the Minister of Energy are doing to be able to capture that innovation. So we are at a stage where productivity in Africa, which has been our challenge, is to increase. And we know that the mode of production are changing rapidly. The words that you Google today, if you Google that word, you will see millions of hits, is artificial intelligence. Everybody is talking about big data, artificial intelligence. There are a lot of applications which are useful for the continent and needed that are popping all over the place. So how we can use those to make sure that we are bringing it to the productive sector in Africa, to the energy sector, to the agriculture sector, so that we can boost our productivity. I'm here with Sergio Pimentel, who is the Vice President for IFC. Sergio, if you want to introduce yourself. He just started as Vice President for Africa and Middle East for IFC. And it's important because it's clear that no solution for development in Africa and productivity increase will be only public sector based. It will have and need a strong private sector. When I talk about private sector, I want to be extremely clear. I'm not talking about private sector only FDI, which is important and essential, but we need to help the domestic private sector in Africa to grow. This is a continent where you don't have yet the critical mass of private sector which will be able to create jobs using this new technology. So seeing young entrepreneurs today telling us what they're doing is a way to showcase the potential and the existing reality of our private sector and making us think both on the public policy side, but also on the private side on what can be done to support them, those who are bringing that new technology in sectors like energy and agriculture. So you will hear a lot of examples, very interesting example of what they're doing. And I just want to give 2 or 3 numbers today. The last bidding on solar brought it to 4 cents a kilowatt in Senegal. For those who've been around, it's something that we have never thought that you can have 4 cents a kilowatt in Africa on solar energy. It's happening, it's reality. So we will continue pushing the adoption of new technology, of new mode of production of energy in Africa to be able to reach this type of result, and more importantly, to scale them up in the rest of the continent. We have a lot of research done by CGIAR on smart agriculture. We need to make sure that this technology is now made available to the farmer, the small farmer in Africa, to increase their productivity. Third, we are trying to increase the value chain and the value addition of African production in the large sector. We just had, 2 days ago, a meeting with the Ghanaian and the Ivorian authorities around the cocoa sector. These 2 countries represent 60% of the world production in cocoa. But as you know, very little is staying in our continent. So what we are doing now is to help those countries to have common policy and to bring financial resources. We'll be taking to our board a project of $200 million for Côte d'Ivoire to help the transformation of cocoa locally. We just took a project of $200 million for cashew nuts to help and improve the transformation of cashew nuts in Africa. So we try to do those type of things more and more in the agriculture sector, but do it intelligently and taking the new technology. So I will stop here. This is supposed to say a few words to introduce the topic, but once again, to thank you so much for being with us for all these years and having that conversation, which now is a much broader conversation, and that we're keeping at least twice a year with you. Thank you very much.
Diop for giving us some opening insights, and of course he will join us on our panel discussion as we look to engage on this topic further, ladies and gentlemen. To set the tone, many of you have received the copy of the Africa Pulse publication, which gives us the latest insight into the economic dynamics that we see within the sub-Saharan African region. To give us some highlights and to paint a clear picture of the landscape that we're dealing with at the moment, please warmly welcome on stage, ladies and gentlemen, the World Bank Chief Economist for the Africa region, Dr. Albert Zufak, who'll join me for a quick fireside conversation in order to really get some insight into the markets that we operate in. Please warmly welcome him on stage. I've been instructed to remind you of who I am, not because of my vanity, but just to ensure that we are all on the same page, ladies and gentlemen, so please do excuse me for that. Let's get into the conversation with regard to the African continent, and many of you just a few years ago might have bemoaned the fact that Africa might be a continent with opportunity and, of course, with great optimism coming through. I think it's fair to say that the last 5 years have been a roller coaster ride. Everything from the drop in commodity prices, which led to economies dipping into recession, finding themselves in some trouble with regard to capital raising initiatives, of course, ratings agencies not making it any easier, and political uncertainty. Happy to say that we are seeing a quick turnaround, because if anything is to give us some sort of sense of confidence is the upbeat numbers in growth. And Dr. Zufek, this is where you can give us more insight. I understand growth for 2017 recorded at 2.6% from 1.5% in 2016. Sounds like we can take a sigh of relief, or is it too soon?
Well, good morning, Gugu.
Fantastic.
And good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and privilege for me to share with you recent findings from our research on African economies. Yes, Gugu, there are three very important messages. One, growth has been rebounding in sub-Saharan Africa. We are actually projecting now that growth will be 3.1% in 2018 and 3.6% in 2019 and 2020. So that's a good news. But this is not fast enough. And our governments need to continue the reforms on the macro side, but also really deepen structural reforms if we are to bring growth back to pre-crisis levels. So yes, there is probably a sigh of relief, but this is no time to relax.
So we can't...
Second important message is that, debt has been rising. Debt has been rising, and this is no news to you in this room because we spoke about this in October. But debt composition has also been changing, and this is exposing our countries to a new type of risk that needs to be managed. So that's extremely important, and that's new. The third message that is extremely important is that our countries need to fully embrace innovation, leverage new technologies to boost productivity across sectors, but also within sectors. And this is so critical for agriculture and energy that we'll be discussing today. So if you allow, I may want to elaborate a little bit on growth.
I'm happy for you too, because it seems as though the music is back on, but the party just hasn't started. Give us a sense and an understanding as to how best we need to be approaching growth going forward, especially given that our economies need to diversify.
Absolutely. Our growth projections are actually premised on two important assumptions. That commodity price keep rising or stabilize at the current level, and that's not certain. And second, that our countries really speed up and also deepen the macroeconomic and structural reforms that they have started. Failing this, we will not be able to continue this positive trend. But there are three hopeful news. The first is that for the first time since 2016, per capita GDP growth has become positive again in Africa. So we have stopped the sliding back. So that's certainly positive. The second hopeful news is that there are significant transition taking place in two of our largest economies, South Africa and Angola, positioning us for higher growth in these two countries. And given their weight in our GDP, this is certainly quite positive. And the third, quite important and hopeful news is that both on the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast, growth prospects have strengthened. Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Tanzania are still growing extremely fast at above 6%. But on the west coast, we are seeing Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal powering through, but also joined now by Ghana and Guinea. So these two groups of countries are among our top performers and certainly positioning us for higher growth. Now, that's not good enough because the CEMAC region continues to struggle. And the need for deeper structural reforms, but also for a smart fiscal adjustment remains in the CEMAC region. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly one of the sub-regions that are keeping me awake at night. And I think it's really important to also notice that although growth has rebounded, we're still very far from the pre-crisis levels.
Mm-hmm. So lots of work that certainly needs to be done in order to continue bolstering economic growth. But there's a D word you mentioned.
Yes.
It wasn't death, it wasn't divorce, but debt. Let's talk about this debt because we've seen African economies actually launching and issuing debt through Euro bonds. But I understand, whilst this seems like a positive because a lot of it is directed to infrastructural growth and development and investment, it's not such a great thing because it also comes with its own level of risk.
Absolutely. There are two things that we need to highlight when it comes to Africa's debt. First is, yes, it's been rising continuously, and between 2010 and 2017, the average debt to GDP ratio has increased by 15 percentage points.
In how long? Remind us again.
Just in 7 years.
Sure.
And in some countries, the debt to GDP ratio has been multiplied by 5 in that period. Mm. So that's a matter of concern. But what is actually quite different this time around is that the composition of our debt has changed and extremely fast. What is happening is countries have now moving away from concessional and long-term financing towards short-term maturities and market-led debt. This is creating new risk and new kind of risk our countries are not equipped now to analyze and manage well. This is certainly an area where we should focus in the future. But more importantly, Google, I think if you just look at Eurobonds issuance to illustrate that point, in the first quarter of 2018 alone, African countries have issued more Eurobonds than the combined year of 2017, just in the first quarter, and still going strong. While this is not a big issue in itself, what we need to worry about is debt sustainability. Because managing those new risks, those market-led risks, are more complex. Maturity mismatches are really raising the questions of how are we going to service this debt, especially given the tightening fiscal space.
Yeah.
Now, if our countries were investing that debt into efficient investment, we will be less concerned. But our latest research is pointing to two directions. Our heavy borrowers, which are countries that have increased their average total public debt by more than 20 percentage points. Our heavy borrowers are indeed investing, but they are investing in inefficient projects. Therefore, growth is actually lower in this category of countries. Mm-hmm. And the second more concerning fact is that in the moderate borrowers category, which are countries for which average debt has increased between 10 and 20 percentage points, just between 2012 and 2017, those countries are actually not investing. They are borrowing for consumption, and that's not how we are positioning for higher growth in the future.
I think it's safe to say that your concerns have been highlighted and, of course, are met with an audience of decision makers within the room and, of course, individuals who can influence the conversation back in their home countries. How do we solve this? You're speaking to individuals who have access to finance ministers across the African continent. Are there solutions?
Yes, there are solutions. And the good news is some of the solutions are already starting to be implemented, but we need to really speed them up and deepen these. First is creating the right fiscal space to service debt. I think it is important to continue efforts in domestic revenue mobilization to be able to have the capacity to service that debt. The second measure is to increase efficiency of investment.
Yeah.
Because there is certainly a lot of wastage happening in our investment, and improving public investment management, right from project selection to implementation, would certainly save us enough resources to actually have a more stable macro framework and capacity to sustain that debt. Third, I think it's crucial for our countries to rethink infrastructure finance. Because some of this debt has actually been in infrastructure deals that were not necessarily thought through properly. Rethinking infrastructure finance and blending different instruments to finance our much needed infrastructure
Indeed.
will be critical.
Indeed. So some tough homework for us to do. As mentioned, it is important that we do move forward, not only with sourcing the solutions, but of course with the conversation today. Dr. Zufek, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
I think whilst we are aware that the tide is turning, we're all going to make extra time to make sure that we speak to you with regard to the critical reforms that need to be developed. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a round of applause for Dr. Zufek for giving us insight today.
Thank you so much, Gugu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that said, ladies and gentlemen, we now get into our panel discussion. And this is, of course, where we invite you to actively participate, building up on the themes that have been highlighted by our two introductory speakers. And, of course, two critical sectors to the African continent, being agriculture and energy. Please allow me to warmly welcome my panelists on stage who will be joining me, and I will call up their names in order of their seating arrangements. Firstly, warmly welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Esther Kunda, who's the Program and Operations Coordinator for Next Einstein Forum, followed by Thierry Tano, who's the Minister for Petroleum, Energy and Renewable Energy in Côte d'Ivoire, Makta Diop, World Bank Vice President for Africa, Rebecca Miano, who's the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of KenGen, and Ugwem Eneo, Co-founder and CEO of Solstice Energy Solutions. Please give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps I should just test again to ensure that the energy levels are right in the room and that we'll continue to share this optimism with our panelists. Are you ready? Africa? Yes. Africa? Right. Now that we know that the litmus test has been conducted and we're comfortable with your levels of optimism on the continent, let's get into this conversation with regard to the dynamics that we see with regard to technology being used as an enabler to develop both agriculture and energy on the continent. And I'd like us to start off with yourself, Minister Tano, by really getting perspective with regard to the role that technology can play. And perhaps it's quite imperative. Speaking to you, we do understand that you have a history at the IFC, and now within your ministerial position, you certainly have both views of the spectrum in really understanding what are the key dynamics that we need to ensure that not only collaboration takes place, but of course with the view of technology and digital as a key enabler.
Thank you very much. I'd like first to thank the Africa regions for inviting us in such a great event, and for Maktar's, my brother's leadership into this particular event, which is, I think, very important for Africa. I was asked very recently at a different panel, what's the difference between being a vice president at IFC and holding a position for the government. The pressure is very different. The social pressure, especially in the energy sector and reaching out to the people and making sure they have access to electricity, which is a source of life. And as we said in this institution, in contributing to changing people's lives for the better is extremely important. And therefore, the pressure that we are living on a daily basis is very different. What we're seeing is this new technology in this sector as not only a way to live, it's a revolution. So you're combining different new technology that should translate into allowing and providing the opportunity for the governments and public sector to reach out to more people on something so critical as energy. And let me be very brief, but at least tell you where I'm coming from. If you combine the demographic growth with the sustained economic growth in the region, you run the numbers, it's very clear that public resources won't be enough to be able, I think, to provide what the people need. Therefore, the private sector's role in our sector is critical. Without them, it's impossible. So what do we have to do? Our role, and with institutions like the World Bank also, is to provide the macroeconomic environment and the environment to attract the private sector. How do we do this? If you look at the energy sector, the critical aspect to attract investors is to make sure that your sector is financially viable, which is very difficult for a public sector service. What are we providing? We are providing a service by providing electricity. But we're providing electricity also to everybody. That's the aim. And therefore, reaching out to some in the poorest region or to the region that are less accessible with less infrastructure, this is where it costs more for us. And therefore, the difficulty is to reach out to them. Technology is giving us this opportunity. Today, there's a possibility with mobile telephone, with prepaid bills, to be able to reach out to people that have not even road access, but have access to natural resources, which is the sun. By doing this, we can provide light to these people. And light is a source of life. It allows you to give better educations to people, better health care, okay? But also even to mechanize the agriculture and therefore increase revenues to farmers.
Sure.
So the potentials is just unlimited, I would say, but the greatness of the system is that with, as Mokhtar said, with the price of power, electricity going down, we're going to be able to reach out to much more people. So we government, we need to be able to give the comfort to the private sector to come, invest, and making sure that they will make money, but they will make money in a sustainable way, and making sure also that the social and the public service component of giving electricity to people is also taken into consideration, and this is our role.
Exactly. I'd like to stay with you, Minister, to continue with that particular flow. As you know, the optimism in the room is that we are able, we are willing, and certainly there have been gains that have been made within your specific economy to actually drive and cultivate that conversation regarding innovation. What kind of conversations are you having from a framework and regulation point of view in order to ensure that there is a bottom-up approach to evolving and incorporating digital as well as technology as an enabler within the energy sector?
Yeah, and I think that's critical. To get a bottom-up approach, you need to be able first to understand what the market is, what the people want, and how you can fulfill their needs. In order to achieve that, you need to be able to combine your ability to reach out to people, but also your ability to listen to investors and their capacity with new technology to provide you not only the best, but the optimized service to your customers, which is giving them what they need at a price which is competitive. And remember, I'm not saying the cheapest price. I'm saying a competitive price, because you need to be able to feed in sufficient resources so that the private sector can continue to grow, continue its research and development, and making sure that in the long run, you're reducing the cost of access to electricity. So what do? Is we are discussing with the private sector and making sure that we're providing the environment in terms of tax incentive, in terms of fiscal incentive to the investors, to make sure that their investment is geared toward the long term. This is an industry, it's not a 100-meter, it's a marathon. So we need to make sure that over the distance, we're able to make the investment that really turns into growth, economic growth. And this is going to be found in rural areas. Africa has this element, and we need to take this into consideration. Most of our populations is in rural areas. And connecting them to the national grid is more expensive. And therefore, what you're going to see, and I think my vision, my sense of where the sector is going in the future, is that instead of seeing these big national grids that we used to see, you're going to see much more localized production capacities with smaller off-grid solutions that will translate into cheaper and more accessible solutions in the future. What you've seen in terms of the revolutions, and I think you can draw a parallel between the computer industry and the telephony industry. You will see in the energy sector. For those in the room that have my age, I just turned 56. When I started to work, and we used to call a mini computer or a laptop computer, it was a suitcase. Okay. For those who have seen the first mobile phone, it was also a suitcase.
Yeah.
And look at what it is today. So translate this into what the energy sector would be in 15 years. I certainly am part of the people that see the glass half full for Africa, and I'm very optimistic about our region.
Indeed. Makta, let's come to you. I think clearly the audience is agreeing with the Minister with regard to competitiveness and, of course, ensuring that governments actually do listen. So it is refreshing, and we can say it. Governments are listening to what their stakeholders actually want. And Makta, obviously, as a representative of the World Bank, this is where you come in. You're following the lead and, of course, participating with governments as well as fellow stakeholders in their participation in really driving the use of technology. Give us a sense and an understanding as to just how far the World Bank is with incorporating its power, its influence, and of course participation in driving digital and the technology drive in the energy space.
This morning I was with some partners from Korea. We'll be supporting African countries to have more PhDs and masters in science and technology. It was to support the Next Einstein initiative in Africa. President Kagame hosted twice a large meeting on science and technology. Senegal did it, I believe, and I visited 2 weeks ago the Yamoussoukro complex in Abidjan, which is a state-of-the-art center for engineering in Africa. So what does it mean? Does that mean that I mentioned artificial intelligence? Let's learn about the internet revolution in the world. We built infrastructure, and Africa was totally absent in the content. We are, actually, it just accelerated our import of goods or services, but didn't allow us really to export because we're not there on the content. So I think that we need to do two things. First, size matter. We need to have larger markets. And we had a meeting this week on energy to try to make the power pool functioning. And Minister Tano, Thierry, was there and was a panelist actually in that discussion. And the idea was, we are building infrastructure, interconnecting our countries, but we are not trading as much as we could on electricity. Why? Because we don't have a mechanism which allows us to secure payment and things. So we need to have some structure, and we are moving that direction to have a kind of supranational entity which allows people to trade and have larger market.
Sure.
Why larger market matter is because technology is expensive. The initial cost, the sunk cost of R&D and so forth in a sector are large. So the larger the market is, the faster you amortize that initial cost is that R&D investment that you are doing. Secondly, we need to have the people there to be able to man or woman the technology, to be able to handle it, and not to have always experts coming from abroad and doing it for us.
Sure.
It will be important as we're entering this new technology to train people accordingly. And for that, we need to strengthen our academic institution in science and technology. Only 20% of young Africans coming from university are trained in STEM. This is not acceptable. So we are trying to work, and I would love to see more masters in big data, more masters in artificial intelligence, strengthening the mathematics and science content of higher education, so that we can be part of that. So the last point is, if we do all that without having the basic infrastructure and access to the fiber optic or on internet, we will not be able to move as fast. So we're trying to be very opportunistic. Now, in every project of the World Bank where we are building a road, we are trying to put fiber optic under that road. Anytime now we'll be building a transmission line, we will be putting some fiber optic so that the farmers will be having the mobile device, will be able to access the market, get the information, and it changed totally the way we are thinking about it. Exactly. Cooperative will be more and more now, instead of being only places where you buy the goods, but they will become knowledge center to provide the information to the farmer on how to use the best technology.
Exactly. So clearly a multi-pronged approach to ensure that we make the significant gains that we're looking for. You did mention something earlier regarding gender parity. And I think for many of us looking at today's panel, it is quite refreshing that we see that being represented today. So perhaps an acknowledgement on the World Bank's part as well with regard to this change. And I'll tell you why it's so critical, because Rebecca, that makes me come to you. You serve as the CEO and Managing Director of KenGen, the first female to do so since the entity's establishment in the last 60 years. Not only that, but you also are participating in changing the landscape with regard to this innovation that we see, seeking alternative sources of energy in order to bring those solutions to the grid. Geothermal is certainly where KenGen has exploited an opportunity here, and it's served them for the better. Give us an overview of how geothermal from a KenGen perspective has actually changed the dynamics for your entity, and of course, how you're looking to alter this going forward, looking at other alternatives of power supply in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Gugu. I'm extremely excited to be here today from Kenya, and also to tell the geothermal story that you've asked about. And along the Rift Valley, there is this enormous resource of geothermal, but for many years it wasn't exploited. And in Kenya, we were highly dependent on hydrology, that is the hydroelectric generation, taking little regard of the geothermal. But as we all know, the unreliability of the hydro, with drought and all, and the vagaries of weather. But geothermal is safely not affected by the weather. And over the last 10 years, Kenya has paid special attention to the geothermal field, and Kenya has now exploited about 633 megawatts of geothermal. And this has placed Kenya at number 8 in the world of the geothermal generators, and this has really helped. I'll give you an example. We have had drought for the last 3 years, but because of the geothermal exploitation, the country has not quite suffered from the drought because geothermal has complemented the generation of power.
Sure.
And 10 years ago, when we had a similar drought, we didn't have as much geothermal exploited. I remember vividly that the country used to have power 3 days in a week, and was also supplemented by very expensive emergency generators. In 2017, same scenario. Many Kenyans did not realize that we had drought because of the geothermal. And it's a huge resource, about a potential of 10,000 megawatts. So we have a lot to do. And this will really change the landscape because we will have reliable and firm power in the country that will not be shaken by drought and other things. We also have wind and solar. And I'm glad to say that out of the modest 2,370 megawatts that Kenya has, 70% is renewable clean energy. Yeah, thank you.
I think a round of applause indeed. On that, we don't want you to be very humble about these achievements. So, of course, they are insight that we certainly look to duplicate within other markets on the African continent. But very briefly, I want to get your sense and understanding, as we mentioned in the introductory comments, that is certainly from a top-down approach point of view with regard to ensuring that there's alternative sources of power to push into the grid. But what's the level of participation like with other microgrid solutions or off-grid solutions, and ensuring that as KenGen, you are participating in that conversation to ensure that elements like M-Kopa do not become a friend or foe, but rather a partner with regard to the move towards and using technology as an enabler?
Yes, thank you. Of course, the hydro and geothermal are not enough yet to have the country fully have enough power. And so we have the mini-grids, the solars, and of course, you've talked about the M-Kopa, which is a product that enables Kenyans to use solar panels to have enough power. And as KenGen, we are supportive of that. We do support even communities being able to generate power using solar, the small winds, and we really, really are supportive of that, so that the mini grids, the microgrids, then supplement the national grid, and therefore enhance the accessibility of power and the connectivity.
You mentioned support as a word, and I'm sure there are a few entrepreneurs who might be here and they're thinking, what kind of support? Is this capital? Is this mentorship? Give us a sense and an understanding as to just how in-depth this
technical support and mentorship support, and encouraging communities, especially where our installations are located, to be able to work with them, to partner with them, and be able to educate them on what else they can do to access power where there is no national grid.
Indeed. Ugwem, I'd like to come to you because you're one of those entrepreneurs that I was referring to who would have asked the question regarding that kind of support. And I think for many of you in the room, we've naturally had conversations previously about this digital age that we're living in and the Internet of Things. I'm not too sure how many of you might have the luxury of being to access your phone and closing the curtains at home, looking into your fridge and having your fridge tell you just what's short on your grocery list. But imagine being able to sit at home and actually monitor the electricity supply at your property right this moment, whether it's on, whether it's off, how much you have in storage, and just exactly how to source other alternatives should there be a problem. Well, that's exactly what your solution does, Igwem. Hopefully I've elaborated quite easily and effectively on it. But coming to that, you've naturally looked at the solution. You've obviously are rolling rollouts with regard to an opportunity in Nigeria. But paint a picture of the environment with regard to coming in as an entrepreneur, sourcing these solutions, using digital, and having to navigate what sometimes appears to be such a tricky landscape to ensure that your product actually does make it into the lives and homes of many Nigerians who one day might sit in this audience and actually monitor their power supply in their property.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me today. I think it'd be good to start with the background of how Solstice came to be and how we even began exploring the world of IoT and intelligent energy management in the context of Nigeria and similar markets. So the core technology is actually the product of research that my co-founder and I were conducting at Stanford University, and we were looking at smart grids and grids of the future, but often in the context of the United States, Europe, and parts of Asia. But one of the barriers we often had was addressing existing infrastructure. And so my colleague and I decided to shift our focus and say, what would grids of the future look like in the context of countries like Nigeria and similar markets where we actually have the ability to complement unreliable electricity coming from the utility. And one of the key things we realized was that distributed energy resources will play an increasingly important role in the energy landscape, not only in Nigeria, but in similar markets. And as these resources become more diverse and complex, this ultimately calls for more intelligent, flexible systems that have better management associated with them. And so that's really where we got started with Solstice Energy Solutions, with this idea that we need to be able to connect and intelligently manage and understand what the energy landscape looks like. And being able to pull in data in real time helps us not only better plan for grid modernization efforts, but better serve consumers at both the nanogrid level, microgrid level, and even when we look at the utility level.
With that said, though, I want to also pick up naturally on the environment and enabling factors. You've naturally had to cooperate with larger government and regulators and players within the electricity environment. What conversations have you had in order to ensure that this can exist?
Sure. So we actually had quite a bit of pivots in our product and our strategy because we had developed solutions that I guess you can call were accessories. So new to the market, add-on management intelligence, these additional items. And as we began to look at the market, it's kind of challenging to introduce new technology where you have barriers to understanding, education, adoption, and even cost. So one of our key approaches was actually to look at the existing energy landscape, look at the stakeholders, look at existing infrastructure, and how do we look at those solutions and take them from dumb or mechanical devices to digital and smart devices and enter the market in a way that complements or is integrating with existing infrastructure. So by doing that, we're able to find partners in people like the utilities and the distribution companies, in generator companies, in solar providers, versus being an additional accessory to their offering. So enhancing product offerings, adding value to existing stakeholders was key in actually product development and R&D, not something that we thought about after development.
Indeed. That plays a critical role. Magda, I see you have a question for her or a comment as a follow-up on that.
You have here a wonderful audience. You have policymakers, very, very important people here, ministers from finance, minister of energy, say all want to solve that problem. You have a wonderful opportunity to tell them what is the obstacle for them to use your technology. So what do you tell them? If you have 3 minutes now to win their heart.
Use this opportunity. Data is your friend. And I say that in that one of the biggest challenges I faced from not only research and development, but working with stakeholders as we're trying to solve problems, as we're trying to plan, as we're trying to figure out where to best place our investment, is that there was very poor data to actually make informed decisions from all levels of the ecosystem, whether I'm talking about a consumer who's trying to make a decision about what power source they should use for their new factory, to the distribution companies who are trying to better plan where they should place their investments and how they should recover their cost. And oftentimes we're nervous about deploying IoT and connected devices that will be collecting data, sometimes for privacy reasons, but also because sometimes it's revealing a lot of problems that we actually do have. But I think that that's critical in actually finding the best ways to move forward. Otherwise, we're figuratively and literally operating in the dark. So supporting entities that are really trying to better understand what the ecosystem looks like, not for the sake of revealing what all the problems are, but for the sake of being able to make more informed, better decisions, is critical for better serving consumers, as well as better serving grid modernization efforts in our communities.
Policymakers, are you taking notes? I saw the minister here scribbling very quickly, so at least we certainly have your ears. I'd like to come to you to get your perspective, because you're also a fellow entrepreneur, this time within the agricultural space, and of course seeing a lot of developments, and you yourself have also worked with technologies in order to bring abilities to farmers to access markets. You've heard some of the insight that your colleagues have shared with regard to access to data. Of course, skills is also a critical element that comes into play, which you've had first-hand experience with.
Thank you, Gugu. I think for me, what I'm going to say is I was an entrepreneur, and because of some of the problems that we're talking about, I pivoted into being one of the creator of the ecosystem and in creating the ecosystem with the Next Einstein Farm. Sure. So if I can go back with my experience, when I was in third year in an undergrad, I created an application to give farmers agricultural information. This was in 2012. Mobile penetration in Rwanda was under 40%. So basically, no farmers had access, they could not access that information because they didn't have mobile phones. But fast forward to right now, the mobile penetration is over 80%, which means in 6 years now, most farmers actually now can have that kind of information. So we struggled through all the different problems, being a young person in 2012, not knowing what farmers actually want, where to get to source the right information, and having an ecosystem that is not connected, where people don't know if I'm a young entrepreneur, I'm a tech entrepreneur, but I don't know where to find the agronomists that could actually come and help me provide that information. So creating that ecosystem was one of the big problems. And so far, we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture through those problems with policymakers. It was a long road, but later on, we recently created a group of young entrepreneurs in agriculture that are both in technology, that are actually doing the farming, that are also doing valorization of the products that are of the crops, right? So basically, the idea here is with technology, how do we get Africans, especially in agriculture, to get from food production to food valorization and creating a whole value chain of that. So one of the problems now that I'm at the Next Science Forum, recently I was in DRC, I saw this young man who had created this technology called aquaponics. I believe most people in agriculture know.
For those of us who aren't aware, what does it entail?
So basically it's using fish and technology, some sort of technology so that you don't use land to produce food and vegetables. So with a mix of fish and some sort of seeds to be able to produce some vegetables and all that.
So this is Finding Nemo, but turning him into beef.
Yeah. So, but this is a technology. Okay. But this is a technology that is really used in other countries that are in other developed countries everywhere else. But then the young man adopted that technology and then adapted it to Africa. So instead of using seeds that are not available in Africa, he found a way to use palm oil seeds, the little ones that are in palm oil. Mm-hmm. So there's those innovations, but he's in a university somewhere. He's not able to scale such innovation. And one of the things when we talk about agriculture especially, and I think also when it comes to energy, is the research that is being done at the university, in research labs, as well as the young innovators. Let's say, for example, if Ms. Eneo doesn't have this kind of platform, how is she going to scale her innovation? How is it going to get to Rwanda, to my home right now? So the kind of ecosystem that is not there to be able to scale is what is needed right now. And that is one of the few challenges that we're seeing right now.
In your experience, how do you believe we can solve that? Especially if you can take us into your confidence regarding the conversations you had with the Ministry of Agriculture in Rwanda, and how perhaps that message was also shared across other ministries to ensure that there's a key focus in really scaling up on the projects that you look to develop.
I think right now, and being Rwandan, I've seen several ideas come to form in terms of technology, is policymakers have to be open to innovation. Innovation is not a threat. And one of the things we see at the Next Science Forum is the development of Africa will be best on science and technology. That is the basis of what we are currently doing. So as a policymaker, when you see innovators that are coming out with new invention, with research, how do you create that link to make sure that you get someone from the lab, you get someone from the backyard, somewhere. Right now in the US, they say in the garage of their parents. How do you get them somewhere from that ecosystem and then bring them where you can scale the ideas, sure, where you can be able to say, okay, we have this idea. How do you create pilots? How do you create demonstrations that are going to scale up so that we can find financing opportunities, we can find the right regulations while it's still growing. Mm-hmm. But also, one of the things is not fearing innovation. If you can give one of the examples with the drone policy in Rwanda, I believe Rwanda is one of the countries that has a drone policy so far in the world, right? And we've seen several, both in health as well as in agriculture, we've seen its impact. In health, it has reduced the delivery of blood from 3 hours to 30 minutes. In agriculture, it's helping in terms of monitoring soil, in helping give data to farmers on how the soil moisture, seeds, and all that kind of stuff. But that means that being very open to innovation and understanding that regulation will happen as you go along is the right approach. So at the Next Science Time, we're creating these roundtables between governments, universities, and industry, especially because, as the minister was saying, you need the private sector to create sustainability of any sector, whether energy or agriculture. Indeed. So having those roundtables, we believe, will help us bridge the gap between the research that is being done in labs somewhere, in labs at the universities, as well as between policymakers, so they can be able to understand the technologies right when it's being created, invented, or developed.
Indeed. Yeah. Ensuring that you can fail fast and fail forward. Minister Tano, there's a comment that you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, and I think it's being here today is what can be the role, what should be the role of the institutions such as the World Bank. A lot of things. I mean, this institution has a lot of resources. I mean, when you look at the impact it has worldwide. The capacity, I think, for this institution to support us comes also in how do you disseminate best practices, what you've seen that works in other regions of the world, what is being the best practice in what we're trying to implement, and feed this to the region. I think this is where there's a huge need that, and certainly a meeting like this one is one, but I think we need more than that. When we need to be able is the World Bank to give us advice on what's the best way to put the best environment to attract the private sector, even if we think we know it. There's things evolve every year, every day in terms of technology. Sure. What are the best practices so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? That, I think, would make a huge difference if there's a way to channel on a regular basis this information to policymakers. There's a lot of mistakes that we're making in Africa that would not be made. So this is an appeal again to this institution based on the quality of people that you have and the role that you could play beyond what you're doing today, which is really to enhance our ability not to make mistakes, but also to enhance our ability to make the right decision based on what we've seen worldwide.
Indeed. Quite critical because it does speak to the element of collaboration, which is what we all gathered here for as representatives of various parties and stakeholders. If you want to go quickly, they say go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So I'm calling on your collaborative efforts now in order to engage with many of you as you are policyholders in the room, entrepreneurs, as well as representatives of other particular stakes within society. And we'd like to get your questions that you can pose to the entrepreneurs, that you can pose to the World Bank, that you can pose to the minister to really source an understanding as to how best Africa can now implement developments from a regional point of view, from a country point of view, to really fast-track agriculture and energy. Any questions on the floor? We'll take questions in a series of 3. If you can, please keep them concise, short and to the point, and we'll get a response from the panelists. We'll start with you, sir. I don't know if there's another hand. We'd like to take 3 back-to-back. So if there are 2 more questions, feel free to stand up or raise your hand, and a roving mic will make its way to you. You can go ahead, sir.
So if I can summarize what we heard from most of the speakers, but more clearly from Mr. Diop, it's the university. So indeed, this institution did not invest enough in universities. The knowledge, the extension service of the universities can do a lot of things that you are talking about. So a request from the panel is to insist at the bank to start working with the universities. The universities in Africa are not improving.
Thank you so much for your comments, sir. Mr. Diop, we'll come to you shortly to get your response. There's a hand right here. You can go ahead with your question as soon as the mic gets to you.
Thank you. It's probably correct to be concerned about the changing nature of Africa's debt. But for most policymakers, the shift to Eurobonds and the international capital markets is not a matter of choice. It's because the concessionary window is closing, and largely because for many of the countries, GDP per capita is putting them beyond either range, and we know that the continent faces severe income inequalities, and GDP per capita is just some number. It doesn't speak to the reality of the poverty that is still prevalent. And so to yet the same bank, bank that is closing down the concessionary window, expressing a concern about these countries shifting to the international capital markets, I'm not sure really.
I'll tell you what, sir, we'll ensure that Dr. Zufek does have time to address that particular question adequately to ensure that you're comfortable and, of course, can engage further on that. I do see your hand up, ma'am. We'll go to you. And then a second roving mic can make its way to you, sir. Following your question, ma'am, we'll get some responses from the panel. You can go ahead.
Could you please address the nexus of energy and agriculture? Energy is often a binding constraint, as we all know, to the mechanization and industrialization of the ag sector, which is one of the key national strategies of most African countries for their development. So how are your organizations collaborating across these sectors to ensure co-development in this space?
Fantastic question. Thank you so much, ma'am. Let's start off with the first question, and Mr. Diop, that is certainly addressed to you. Sufficient funding and capital allocation to universities. Is this something that the World Bank will take a look at?
No, we're looking into it very seriously. And it's true that in the past we had let's work on higher education. And in the last 5-6 years, there were a lot of a big shift. We have developed the PACET initiative. We worked with the university. We worked with the Center of Excellence in Africa. We put $200 million to support the Center of Excellence. And we want to focus on science and technology. We would like to do that and to make sure that as we're scaling up our effort in the higher education, that we're doing for something which serves the productive sector. And so therefore, for us, technology, science is central to it. But to be able to build a strong education system at the highest level, you need to ensure that the degrading quality of our secondary education is stopped. It's very sad when I see that the quality of education I received growing up in Senegal is better than the quality of education that today kids are receiving. And it's not specific in my country. It's a generalized situation in the continent. You see a situation where teachers don't master the curriculum. So we need to work on all elements of the education system to make sure our curriculum much more targeted and centered to solve issues. Indeed. I think that you say something very important to come back, and I would like to emphasize it. It's the issue of technology and legislation. I think that it will be exactly the way you describe it. We need to more and more be in a space of problem solving. What is the problem we want to solve, and align all the legislation, the public investment, the private sector incentive to solve that problem. And not doing in a little bit more academic way, which is we sit and we dream about the perfect law that we want to apply in our country, the perfect institutions, without taking into account our own reality. And I think that is something which is very characteristic of Africa, to be very blunt and honest and direct. A lot of our laws and institutions are just a Xerox copy of what we inherited from the colonial time, and not really taking into account what are the specificity, the social contract in our countries, the reality, the nature of institutions, so that we can build something, we respond immediately to the issues that we are facing. And the same is happening on technology. The same is happening on adoption of technology. And I think that the initiative like the New Einstein and so forth is. Lastly, what I would like to suggest to answer to that question, we need to create, I think the Minister Tano is perfectly right. This is just the beginning of a conversation. What I would like to suggest after this, if we can try now to be very specific, there's a lot of fora in Africa talking about African development. Let's pick one or two of these many meetings and focus on something which is solving a very practical problem. Productivity in agriculture. And I would love to start having a meeting where we bring the private sector, bring all the startups in Africa working on agriculture, policymakers in a 2-3 day event, identify some specific issues and come out of it with solutions, and more importantly, with deals which are sealed between private sector, between startup and with policymakers. What we should be driving more in the World Bank, more of it, is to, from the beginning in our project, to use the new technology to help socialize it. We have larger projects, and I think that we're doing some of it, but we can do more to start adopting your technology, and putting when we are presenting a project to the government.
Mr. Diop, I know you're very passionate, but I do need to give your colleagues on the panel an opportunity to also share their feedback. Esther, you wanted to follow up on the university's question, and perhaps if we can also tie your response in to a critical question which was raised, collaborative efforts. How do we ensure that there's a nexus between energy together with agriculture, and how we can get entrepreneurs like yourself speaking to your peers on the continent?
So in terms of, especially on the university part, we all know Africa produces only 0.2% in terms of research. That's the African contribution in research output. And one big problem that we've seen is there's no specific idea of what we want as an output from our education system. Countries do not have, most African countries do not have a plan or a strategy plan of what do we want to get in terms of skills, what kind of skills do we want, and then what are the main sectors. Let's say, for example, a country like Nigeria, the biggest oil producers.
Sure.
At the education system really targeting their oil production? Is it targeting all the skills that they need? If you have a country that has, in terms of agriculture, whatever crop that they that is the main, let's say cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire, is the education system producing research that is targeted to that specific crop? So I think one of the biggest problem we have with our education system is having strategies that are aligned with an education strategy that is aligned with what countries need and country strategies in general.
And being deliberate in those efforts.
Yeah, and being
Sure.
deliberate in terms of tying everything into one. So the energy sector should not be alone, the agricultural sector should not be alone, everything is tied in. The education sector also ties into that.
Sure.
And in terms
Very
of
briefly.
And in terms of the collaboration efforts, one of the things that we've seen is researchers are also, everyone is in their own lab, they don't know what's happening in any other sector. So we've created this NEF community of scientists that is composed of world-class scientists. They're best in Europe, they're best in the US, and they're doing technology that spearheading blockchain technologies like blockchain, things in cancer, the genetics, cancer, and all the various things. But when we bring them together and they start discussing the various research output, they start thinking of how to collaborate, right? So how that's when you would see that someone who's in energy would say, okay, if I know there's biofuels, right? If you're using biofuels, it has some sort of crops. You grow crops and then you can produce energy out of that. How do you get that kind of synergy together?
Exactly.
So through that creation of the NEF community of scientists, we've been able to bring these scientists that are doing different things to discuss what they do and where the synergies are.
Indeed.
And we believe they can apply that to, if countries start implementing their own strategy, their knowledge could also be applied to those strategies.
About sharing that information, quite critical. In the interest of time, we'll take one more round of 3 questions. There are 3 hands already up. The closest, wherever the mic can get to first, the 3 gentlemen, we'd like to address your questions. I do see there were hands on the side. Oh, your hand was also up, ma'am.
Yeah.
You'll have to forgive me. The lights were rather bright up here on the stage, so unfortunately our focus
I
had
have to
tended
hold
to
the mic.
fall onto the center. However, wherever the mic is first, you can go ahead. I like this. We're fighting over mics, which means that we're keen to share interest, right, and conversations.
Sure.
Wherever the mic is first, go ahead with your question, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Kunda and Ms. Inio mentioned lots of things on pilot projects and so on, and Mr. Tano mentioned that we should not repeat the old mistakes. Bill Gates mentioned this morning that we should have the philanthropic funds to fund pilot projects where the risks are high. What can be done to go from good practices to scale? Should we consider pilot to scale fund, a separate window with philanthropic funds and World Bank and other banks involved in it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. A very key question. Wherever the mic is next, I see.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. My name is Duncan Hart from Crown Agents. With the cost of off-grid solar falling significantly in recent years, 20 cents per kilowatt for solar and around 60 cents per kilowatt for diesel generators, what are the barriers for really expanding this growth? Because clearly there's a lot of potential here. What more does the international community and governments need to do to enable off-grid solar to really take off in the coming years?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, sir, for your question. You can go ahead, ma'am.
Okay.
So I think answering all the questions is actually going to be quite easy because it looks like all of our questions are building off of each other. But I was very interested to hear the perspectives on just energy development. And I definitely wanted to raise the issue of kind of financing and the funding gap. and specifically if there are any developments or innovations or what your views are on that, because I think we all agree that there's definitely a need for energy and a need for innovations when it comes to access. But every time I hear the numbers on the financing and thinking about how to scale large projects and even kind of rural electrification, but the need for the funding around that, I kind of worry that that might be a hindrance. So I'd love to hear your views on what sort of developments and innovations there are to deal with that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your questions. In the interest of time, we do have 10 more minutes before the session ends. So what I'd like to recommend is that perhaps we do combine those questions and make our way down the panel to source responses, as well as, most importantly, critical elements to ensure that these conversations don't take place again next year this time, that we can actually shift the needle when it comes to financing as well as funding models. Regarding the question on private sector participation, perhaps we should look at various stages of funding and participation. Anyone keen to take that on the panel? Sure, let's go with you, Ogwem.
So I'll try to answer the questions quickly in one response.
Sure.
See if we can do that. So with regards to funding, especially being a company that came from labs at the university and trying to take that to the field, to pilots, and then to scale, the funding is quite challenging because, at least for us, we're looking at innovation that includes hardware, innovation that would require, that's looking at a market segment that's not bottom of the pyramid per se. So we particularly look at grid-connected consumers. So a lot of the funding that's getting pushed into our market, especially philanthropic funding, is really targeted to low-income, rural, bottom of the pyramid, software, fintech, and strays away from the unattractive hardware components and a market segment that's typically not as attractive for philanthropic funding. So we had to actually be quite strategic in where we found funding, and I mean, I'm quite fortunate that my team is actually headquartered in the States, and we can find funding from US entities and VCs here and worldwide, but I do think that's going to be a challenge if we're really trying to see raw innovation and technology that's coming out of the continent, finding funding that can support that, that's not only targeted towards solely social impact initiatives and innovation. So I think that's one thing that I'm also looking forward to see how things evolve and change. With regards to the solar, basically solar and generators comparison and how we're going to see a transition from widespread dependence on generators to increasing adoption of solar and storage technology. I think when I look at the market of Nigeria, the largest consuming sector of electricity is residential and commercial. They're primarily in urban areas, they're grid tied, and they're using generators. And the generator capacity easily rivals the capacity that's actually on grid. And so one of the biggest challenges is you need to find solar and storage solutions that can, from a power perspective, compete with the generator, and the capital cost is often the barrier. It's cheaper for me to just go buy a generator now, although I know that levelized cost of energy is more favorable with solar, that financing and access to capital and innovative business models around solar and storage or energy as a service is still a challenge. And so finding ways to finance startups and companies that have business models that can lower that barrier to adoption is key to driving adoption of solar and storage in these markets. And that's what's really exciting about Solstice, my company, is we're really trying to develop technologies that give you the data, the control, the monitoring, revenue collection to reduce those barriers.
Fantastic. Rebecca, if we could get your response. I do have a question that's come through online, which I will address after your response, Rebecca, to the rest of the panel. And specifically, if you could also speak to the challenges with regard to the barriers with regard to getting more solar solutions onto the grid, given that that's one of your areas of focus at KenGen.
Thank you. Thank you, Gugu. Some of the barriers to the solar solution is specifically awareness. There's so many off-grid consumers who do not understand why they are not in the grid, and they don't even understand that solar can give energy. And so we need a campaign and an awareness that is specifically and intentionally intended to make sure that people understand why they need solar. we also have the barrier of technology. We still get the big, big panels that require a lot of land. And so if we have innovations that work on that technology for solar, that will assist. And also resources. There are so many competing needs in our African economy, our Kenyan economy. There is food, education, and other things. So many people don't find solar or electricity or energy as a priority. And we need to actually go out there and try and find cheaper resources like the one we have in copper in Kenya to be able to accelerate the solar uptick. And I also wanted to add something about energy, the nexus between energy and agriculture.
Sure.
I think energy is the biggest enabler of agriculture in terms of modern farming technologies, research, development. It's going to be a game changer if governments really ensure that there is energy that will propel the agriculture sector, because we know that in Africa, agriculture becomes so hard when it is fully manual. But if we have the energy, it becomes easier, it becomes faster, and that way, that's how governments and countries are going to achieve even food security.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your responses to those questions. We do have a question that's come in from one of our online viewers. And the question is, what can the bank do to help youth agribusiness, such as the example of the gentleman in the DRC who's exploring the opportunity of aquaponics? How can the bank interest the private sector? Mr. Diop, I assume that one is for you. Attracting the youth in agribusiness.
First of all, is to listen to them, to know what they need, and I think that we haven't done enough of it. We would like to find instruments which are much more. The problem we are facing is that we have large projects which are channeled through the government. We don't have this small type of resources that can go directly to the small, very small companies. So we need to find a mechanism, and the way we're doing it is to use a credit line which go into the banking sector, hoping that they will be able to use those resources to. And what we find learning in the implementation is that they don't have necessarily in the banking sector people who are qualified to look at those businesses with different eyes. And they're still looking at it in a very traditional way, and therefore the money that is made available is not channeled to those kind of things. So we need to work much more on that intermediation to be able to reach a large-scale number of people. Adoption of energy. Let's think about it. The leading in solar in the world is a South African, Mr. Musk.
But he's not even in South Africa right now.
He's a South African. He's sending, his objective to send people to the moon. So he has recently in a developing country put, I don't know, basically he put electricity in a whole island. I think that we need to also to be creative. I want to say in a sense, when I'm thinking about this fora where we can bring the smallest startup, private sector government, why don't we try to invite Mr. Musk? He understands Africa, I believe. He's from Africa.
Anyone having on speed dial?
And we need to do these kind of things more to be able to interface the rest of the people who have resources, technology, and we often want to do good, but we don't have necessarily the same frame. Same on the Green Fund. The Green Fund has been a source after Paris COP21 to help on climate change, but it's still in a way conceived in a way where it doesn't allow to channel resources to startup to researcher.
Sure.
Can we use the power of policymakers in Africa to influence that conversation so that this type of stuff can channel? So there is a lot of work of bringing other partners in a dynamic way to solve the issues that we are facing.
Indeed. Minister Tano, if we can get your thoughts and insights, and I'd appreciate it if you could reference particular changes which do need to take place, given that you've been a participant in conversations like this for many years. You gave us the example of the change in the cell phone as well as the laptop. What would you like to see change next year, this time, on conversations regarding this theme?
Okay, excellent. So on the first one, I'd like to briefly come back on two key issues for us. The first one is, you said solar, what is a barrier for more expansion? One has to do with the fact that today, at a competitive level, so the price that you're getting is for getting electricity during the day, so when the sun is shining. In the evening, when you come to storage, then the cost of the electricity then becomes much higher. And the best thing that could occur for Africa is to get this cost of storing energy coming down. And it's coming. As I said, I've told you what I anticipate in a few years is you're going to go one day at the gas station and the pump, and then you'll be refueled by solar energy your car. It's on its way, so it's coming. But today, this is one of the elements. The second thing which is of importance, and I'd like again to bring this to this institution, the cost of financing in Africa is overrated in a sense where we're paying too much because most of the people that are financing this region are unreasonable sometimes expectations. And to be frank, from my position, sometimes it irritates me, where people ask for 25% return on their investment on a 20 years concessions to provide electricity. How do you can justify this? Are you going to say to people that we're going to raise tariffs so that people come with a 25% returns? And to a certain extent, and I'm rebounding to the issue of Eurobond. The good news about Eurobonds, it gives at least an indications of what some of the market are looking in terms of risk. So today, Côte d'Ivoire has launched a 30 years Eurobond, and it gives the pricing. Now, if you get the pricing at 6.625, then you can consider this to be the risk-free for Côte d'Ivoire. So now how do you justify the project that will basically be an electricity project where by the time you have put your power plant in place, it's just a rental we're paying every month. We're paying a capacity.
Sure.
Now look at the difference between a 25% return on your investment and a 6.625 30 years bond. And then you realize that it's just unreasonable. And that to a certain extent, there is a work that has to be done with the bank and the Africa Department of the bank, also with Moody's and all the rating agencies that are coming to the rating in this continent at a different level. And I bet you look at the analysis, most of the investors, and because of my position, I would not say particularly a region, but the African region, I can bet you, is the region where investors have lost the least money over the past 30 years. Yet, if you look at the spread that is required for investors to invest in Africa,
sure,
it's not in line with the measure.
Indeed.
So the last point is what I would like to see next year. What I would like to see next year, and I hope I'll be back here and be able to have something in this state of the region very focused, which we say from last year to this year, this is what we have improved. And to do this, we don't need to take 10, just take one. One where we can say in the spring meeting next year, this is how the bank, the private sectors, and the public sectors have made progress, and this is how it has affected people on the ground.
Sure. Fantastic. Esther, we'll give you 30 seconds to tell us that one element that you will choose to focus on in the year ahead to ensure that you see progress in the agri-space.
So I won't focus on the agri-space, but I'll mostly focus on the community of scientists, because right now that's what I'm working to build. And I'll answer the gentleman's question about piloting innovation. So one thing that I believe in is we need to pilot innovation, and this will be financed mostly. We could have a system where private sector as well as public sector, they both finance the piloting of several projects.
Sure.
And why? Let's say, for example, you take the finance sector or the energy sector or the agriculture sector. They're all in the same line of business. There's new technologies that are coming out that are both that are going to benefit both all those businesses, but they're not yet proven to say that this one is going to adopt it. Yes or no?
Sure.
So one of the things that we're working on right now is an affiliate program where businesses that can finance pilot projects for researchers so that we can see the viable ones that can be scaled up.
Indeed.
And they all contribute. These are small amount of money that they all contribute to piloting these projects. They're not losing anything, but they're trying to prove which technology works best for them.
Indeed.
And we are within this year that we're going to be piloting it and seeing, especially we're going to start with digital economy, as well as precision health, and we have some project in energy. So in all those areas, we hope next year when we come back, we will say we have a roadmap on how to adopt new technologies and how to accelerate growth.
A powerful note to leave it on, where you incorporating the various aspects of economies to ensure growth. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to my panelists for contributing to the conversation today. Indeed, it's been a pleasure being with each and every one of you. And just to gauge if the confidence levels are as strong as when we started this morning, Africa? Yeah. There we go. We're happy to hear that level of optimism. So thank you very much to each and every one of you for participating, including those who have been watching us online through CNBC Africa or live streaming on the World Bank website. A follow-up announcement, though, ladies and gentlemen, for many of you who are likely to participate in conversations going forward, financing the future of food. This will be a conversation to take a look at how best we can maximize finance for development in agriculture value chains. This will be taking place now at 12:30 till 1:30 in the atrium. In the atrium, the financing of food. That's the next event that's taking place. Thank you once more for your time.